in a peaceful little cafe. Emily, a black waitress, stood up for JD Vance and was fired that very night. But the next day, a shocking turn of events changed her life forever. An unexpected opportunity from the very person she had helped every evening. Shift at Maple Cafe was peaceful for Emily. The 25-year-old waitress, the cozy little diner, was a familiar gathering place for elderly patrons, people who came to sip coffee and reminisce about the past for Emily. It was a slow, predictable rhythm, rarely disrupted by surprises, but tonight that tranquility was broken. Just before closing, the doorbell chimed. Emily looked up and froze for a moment. A tall, familiar figure stepped inside. JD Vance. He'd made his name writing about the gritty lives of America's working class. And now he was a big shot in Washington the moment he stepped into the diner. The air shifted, regulars swapped, hushed glances and whispers. JD eased in low-key as ever, though a couple of guys in plain clothes lingered nearby, blending into the scene like shadow security. No doubt he looked beat, probably fresh off the campaign trail. Settling at a small table by the window, he stared out, lost in thought. Emily took a deep breath, steadied herself, and approached his table, keeping her voice as natural as possible. "Good evening. What can I get for you tonight?" "Just a black coffee." JDD replied, his voice low but firm. "And if you have pie, I'll take a slice of. Of course, I'll bring it right out." She turned back toward the counter, feeling the weight of eyes on her. The murmurs grew louder. Some regulars were already shifting uncomfortably, though Emily wasn't entirely sure why. Carefully, she poured the coffee and placed a slice of apple pie on a plate. She reminded herself that he was just another customer. JD Vance or not, she would serve him with the same hospitality as anyone else returning to his table. She gently set down the coffee and pie. "Thank you," he said, taking a sip of the coffee before resuming his gaze out the window. His expression contemplative, he seemed to be reflecting on something, perhaps the reactions he had received at tonight's town hall meeting. Back behind the counter, Emily went on with her tasks, but she kept glancing in his direction. She could sense the tension in the air. Even though JD had once championed the working class, many still questioned his motives. Eventually, an older man stood up. Bill, a regular known for his blunt opinions, Emily held her breath as he walked toward JD's table. JD Vance, right? His voice was sharp, loud enough for everyone to hear. JD looked up, his eyes sharp but calm. "That's me," he answered. Bill crossed his arms, pressing his lips together, before speaking with open disdain. You wrote a whole book about folks like us. You said you understood what it's like to struggle. But look at you now, another politician rubbing elbows with the powerful. You're just like the rest of them, aren't you? Just out for yourself." The air in the diner grew heavy. JD placed his cup down, slowly meeting Bill's gaze with a steady expression. "No," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I haven't forgotten where I came from. I'm still fighting for policies that help the working class. I believe that if you want to change the system, you have to be in it." A few scoffs echoed from nearby tables. "Fighting for us?" Bill sneered, "Or just fighting for more power. You don't belong to us anymore." The words sliced through the room like a cold blade behind the counter. Emily gripped a tray tightly. She had never cared much for politics, but she knew what it felt like to be misjudged, and watching this unfold unsettled her. JD Vance didn't raise his voice, didn't lash out in anger. He only tried to explain, but these people had already decided he was a traitor. The whispers in the diner grew louder, heads shook. It was clear that many didn't believe him, that they thought he was only protecting his own interests. Emily stood in silence, listening to the growing resentment, the way they looked at him, the way they accused him. It didn't sit right with her. She glanced at JD and saw something beyond the political controversy. A man who wasn't just talking about change, but actively working to create it. Yes, he was controversial, but what reformer wasn't? In the end, she couldn't hold back any longer. Stepping out from behind the counter, her voice rang out, though she still felt a slight tremor in her chest. "Shouldn't we at least listen to him?" The entire diner turned to look at her. She took a deep breath, standing firm. "I've read his book," she said, locking eyes with Bill. "He didn't grow up. Well, hey, he lived the kind of life many of us have. Just a kid from a working-class family struggling to escape poverty. She glanced around at the familiar faces, the regulars she had served for years. I know you don't trust him, but if someone like him doesn't speak up, then who will? Are we just going to sit here criticizing those who try to make a difference, instead of asking whether they actually can? A heavy silence settled over the diner. Some patrons lowered their eyes quietly, sipping their coffee. Others glared at her, their disapproval clear. She could feel JD's gaze on her, a mix of surprise and gratitude. He hadn't expected anyone to stand up for him, let alone a waitress in this small town diner. Then the back door swung open. Mr. Lawson, the diner's owner, stepped out, taking in the scene before him. His expression grew more serious as he shifted his gaze from Emily to the regulars. What's going on here? His voice was low, sharp. Emily turned to face him, steadying herself. I was just defending JD Vance, she said, her voice quieter now, but still resolute. Mr. Lawson scanned the room. A few customers shook their heads, their displeasure evident. He let out a slow, heavy sigh. Emily, I know you have your own opinions, but these customers are the backbone of this place. We can't afford tension here, no matter who it's about. She opened her mouth to argue. But Mr. Lawson, I wasn't causing trouble, I was just… He raised a hand, cutting her off. I've made my decision. A long pause hung between them before he spoke again, his tone leaving no room for doubt. I think it's best if you step down, felt like a slap to the face. Maple Cafe, the place she had worked for years, the place she had felt she belonged, was pushing her out simply because she had stood up for someone she believed in. She bit the inside of her cheek, forcing her voice to stay steady. So just because I spoke my mind, Mr. Lawson exhaled. You can stay for a few more days until I find a replacement. But after that, he didn't finish the sentence. But she understood. A lump formed in her throat as she took a step back, her heart sinking. Maple Cafe was a place where she knew every customer, every rhythm of the day. But now for defending someone, she was losing it all. Around her, a few customers chuckled under their breath, amused by the spectacle. Humiliation burned in her chest, her eyes stinging as she fought to keep her composure. She had only wanted to do the right thing, but now it had backfired in the worst possible way. The stares, the whispers, the feeling of rejection settled over her like a bitter taste she couldn't shake. JD Vance remained silent, observing finally. He slowly rose to his feet, grab attitude and regret flickering in his expression. He understood the trouble his presence had caused. Thank you for standing up for me. Emily, his voice was quiet but sincere. But I don't want to be the reason you lose your job. I'll leave now. Emily looked up, blinking rapidly to hold back tears. She didn't know what to say, but in that moment she was grateful that he understood. She gave a small nod, her chest tightening as she watched him turn and walk away. JD stepped out of the diner, the doorbell chiming one last time. Before the door swung shut behind him, a sudden silence swallowed the room. All eyes were on her, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. A black waitress fired for defending JD Vance. But she had no idea that the next morning she would wake up to the biggest shock of her life. The next day, Emily walked into the diner, her heart heavy. The familiar sounds of Maple Cafe felt strangely distant. The clinking of cups, the scent of coffee in the air, everything looked the same. But she knew that nothing was. She wasn't a part of this place anymore. Emily was exhausted after a restless night. The thought of having to find a new job felt like the weight of the world pressing down on her. But what unsettled her even more were the stares she would have to face as she stepped through the door. Glances swept over her, cautious, indifferent, and even laced with a hint of ridicule. Bill raised an eyebrow, murmuring something to the person next to him. An elderly woman in the corner shook her head slightly. A few regulars watched her as if waiting to see how she would react. Emily took a deep breath, keeping her expression composed. She had expected this to them. She was an outsider, someone who had dared to speak up and was now being punished for it. Yet here she was, determined to finish her final days before moving on. The diner started to empty as the lunch rush faded. The bell over the door chimed again. Emily didn't bother looking up, focused instead on the coffee machine, but a hushed murmur of excitement rippled through the room. She froze, her heart skipping a beat as she saw JD Vance standing in the doorway. This time he no longer looked as weary as he had the night before. A faint smile flickered across his face as he stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the room with quiet confidence. He nodded at the curious glances of the regulars, then made his way to the familiar table by the window. The same one he had sat at the night before the diner, fell into silence behind the counter. Mr. Lawson stood motionless, unable to hide his unease. Some of the customers from the previous night exchanged subtle glances, clearly wondering why JD Vance had returned after what had happened. Emily's chest tightened. She wasn't sure why he was back, but she knew every eye in the diner was night. Diner was now on her, suiting herself. She carried over a cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie. She set the plate down gently, offering a polite smile, but didn't linger. She returned to the counter, keeping herself busy, half expecting him to leave, half wondering if this was just an act of courtesy after all the trouble from the night before. But JD didn't leave. He sipped his coffee, slowly occasionally, glancing in her direction as if waiting for the right moment. After a while, he looked up and caught her gaze. He gave a small nod, motioning for her to come over. Emily took a deep breath, steadied herself, then walked to his table. She kept her tone light, maintaining a professional demeanor. "Is there anything else you need?" JD studied her for a moment, his gaze deepening. "No," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I just wanted to thank you." Her brows furrowed slightly in surprise. "Thank me for what?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet, yet waited for "standing up for me last night." He said not many people would do that. She blinked, her heart tightening. She hadn't expected him to remember, let alone care. But in his eyes she saw genuine appreciation. He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "After I left here last night, I thought a lot about what you did." He paused, then continued, "I'm looking for people who can help me connect with the community, and I think you could do that." Emily was stunned. She blinked, trying to make sure she had heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" JD gave a slight smile, his voice persuasive, yet earnest. "My team is always in need of people who understand everyday folks, who can listen and help them be heard." He met her eyes, his expression serious. "If you're interested, I have a spot for you on my campaign team." She was speechless. Her fingers curled slightly around the edge of her apron, as if needing something to hold on to, a job, a real opportunity. A door opening right in front of her, she searched his face for any trace of insincerity. But all she found was honesty. Her heart pounded. She had never cared about politics, but she cared about people. And if this was a chance to help others like her, like the regulars in this diner, she could do that. Finally, she swallowed hard and gave a small nod. Yes, a smile broke across her lips, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'd like that." JD smiled, as if he had known she would say yes around the diner. The regulars exchanged bewildered looks. Some seemed displeased, others simply remained silent, unsure how to react, but Emily no longer cared. She had just realized something: her kindness had been repaid, not with words of gratitude, but with a chance to change her entire life. JD Vance rose from his seat, leaving cash on the table. Before walking out, he nodded to her, an unmistakable nod of trust. "I'll see you soon, Emily. My team will be in touch." Then he stepped out of Maple Cafe, leaving behind a silent room and a waitress whose heart was pounding with the promise of an entirely new, future life. Has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. Emily had the courage to stand up, and in return she found a door she never thought existed. If you were in her position, what would you do? Have you ever experienced a moment where doing the right thing led to an unexpected opportunity? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might inspire someone to step out of their comfort zone. If this story resonated with you, don't hesitate to share it with your friends and loved ones. You never know who might need a reminder that courage and kindness can change everything. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.